And joining me now, Jawad Anani, who is a former Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs in Jordan, and Elizabeth Campbell, who is the Director of the Unrwa in Washington. Thank you to the both of you for joining me today. Elizabeth, I'll start with you there in Washington. Talk to us about the reasons behind Washington cutting aid to Unrwa. Is this politically motivated?
Sure. Well, in fact, we have not yet received a comprehensive reason from the U.S. government as to why they've cut aid to UNRWA. As you know, they've been our longest and largest partner for over 70 years. And that funding was frozen in January and then finally cut just on August 31st. And to date, they have not provided us a comprehensive reason. But we feel confident that is not related to our programs and services that we deliver. And we do believe that it's political and not something, therefore, that we can control.
Let me turn to my guest in the studio here, Jawad Anani. We know Jordan has the largest number of Palestinian refugees outside of Gaza and the West Bank with over 2 million. Jordan is a country that's already struggling economically. How are Palestinians on the ground in Jordan being affected by this?
Well, you know, that is going to affect their schooling and their health services, basically, because these are the most important services they receive. And also, as Elizabeth said, the level of education that is being given out to those students is very good. So in a way, with the Syrian refugees crowding our schools, and we are barely catching up, building new ones, to maintain some sort of a decent level of education. If this comes as another burden, that is going to make things very tight. So it's not only a question of money and budgetary allocations, but it's also a question of not having the necessary facilities for all these students to move from UNRWA to public schools or even private schools in Jordan.
Well, and it's more than 500,000 children in over 700 schools who are educated by these UNRWA schools. So what are their options now that the funding has been cut and their education has been cut? What are the options for them?
Well, we are sorry, you know, that these children are becoming victims of political feuding. We know that as far as Arabs are concerned, you know, the refugee issue is not only an Arab issue, it's an international issue, and it has been like that. And so the fact that you turn it into a political pressure tool, that is going to affect the fates of those children. And unless you begin to scavenge for more funds, and it's going to be a tough job to do over time. But hopefully that the United States, you know, and the President Trump would review his decision.
Elizabeth, the U.S. was responsible for about $364 million in funding to UNRWA, as you said, the largest donor. Where can UNRWA find additional funding to fill this gap?
Sure. Well, we've been working to fill that gap since January when the United States originally froze its funding. And we've gone back to our longtime donors, including throughout Europe, Asia, the Gulf, and we've asked them to increase their contributions. Many have responded very positively. 25 governments have increased their contributions to us this year over last year. And we continue to search to close the gap. We have a deficit of $186 million that we need to close by the end of the year to help ensure that our health clinics and schools do in fact remain open. So we are asking all UN member states, we are looking at private resources, or private donors rather, but it's a very difficult gap to close because it came in such an unexpected and sudden way. It's not something that we had been talking to the United States about. In fact, last December, around this time, we had been negotiating with them to finalize our framework or cooperation for 2018 and felt that and believed strongly that they would in fact be our partner this year. So it was a very sudden and unexpected withdrawal of funding, and we've really been scrambling to recover that large deficit that they've left. But we will keep talking to our existing donors and keep looking for new sources as well.
What about these children, these refugee children who are getting education in these Unrwa schools? And I know they've been in school now for a few weeks now, but the funding is due to run out. What happens to these children? What does it mean for their future if they can't have access to this secure education?
Right, so our education program is known throughout the Middle East as one of the finest in the region, in fact, and our students regularly outperform their national counterparts in all of the areas where we operate. It is a lifeline to their future. It is a lifeline to hope. It provides in all of our schools, girls, equal access to education. 50% of our schools are girls, and that's a statistic that we're very proud of, something that we achieved back in the 1960s and maintain today. So there is no alternative to Unrwa schools. There is no other UN organization who can come in, step in. There's no international NGO. As my colleague here has said, governments in the region are not prepared or willing or able to absorb the scale and scope of our successful school system.
Jawad, Jordan will be hosting a meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly on September 27th, essentially to fundraise to make up for this shortfall. Do you think that they'll be successful, and what other countries could possibly step in to fill the gap?
Well, some of the European countries have already shown empathy with this particular issue. I think also Turkey, our country that we are staying in now, has also shown some empathy. They are going to increase the funds. But like you said, we need reliable, continuous flow of money. Because what would happen in case you dissolved UNRWA, even dissolved UNRWA? That means all these refugees are going to become part of the responsibility, at least, of, say, UNHCR, which is already overburdened by almost 160 million refugees in the world. So in a way, this comes at a time when we have to cope with Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, Yemeni refugees in Jordan, and the same applies to Lebanon and even Turkey. So I don't know how this is going to happen. And if you look at the refugees in both Syria and Iraq, what the situation in Syria and Iraq is extremely up in the air, and nobody knows exactly what will happen. So in a way, we're putting all these children, to quote President Trump, on harm's way. And that is going to be a very tough situation, which is going to breed more terroristic inclinations. It's going to create atmospherics that are not conducive to peace. And so in a way, we are shooting ourselves in the foot by denying those children access to decent living and hope for the future.
Elizabeth, I know we've talked about the importance of education for these Palestinian refugee children, but how important is UNRWA to Palestinian refugees in general?
Yeah, sure. So in many cases, take for example Gaza, UNRWA is the source of employment, access to education, and access to healthcare. So it is at the center of families' lives and their communities. UNRWA is an organization that directly implements all of its services, and it's fundamentally run by the Palestinian refugees themselves. They are our doctors and nurses and teachers. So if you had a significant closure of UNRWA services, you're also looking at a major unemployment issue and a source of income and livelihood, particularly in places where there are no other options, again, like Gaza, or take Lebanon, where Palestinians are not able to lawfully access the labor market. There are no alternative schools. Again, Lebanon is a great example of that, or also Gaza, but also throughout the region. And then, of course, healthcare. Sometimes, it's surprising because I think people are not thinking through the public health risks that would emerge if suddenly UNRWA had to close its clinics and could no longer vaccinate children. That would be a problem that would not be easily confined to the refugee community. So UNRWA is really embedded deeply in the social fabric of these communities, and it is the way in which these communities, it is the source or the ability that these communities have had to thrive over multiple generations and decades.
All right, Jawad Anani, former Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs in Jordan, and Elizabeth Campbell, Director of the Unrwa in Washington. Thank you to the two of you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.